us by the state. It's written in several documents. I can give you links.
Without appropriate mitigation and conditions.
Even with, in some cases, there's mitigation, there's always been conditions. But he asked for...
This is what I'm trying to get at, because I haven't seen the, where it's, every time that I've seen that the geotube will cause a beach scenario, will cause adverse, will have the potential to cause adverse impacts, it's been distinct from, if not properly mitigated and conditioned. I know that's what, in the minutes, if you wanted to have the counsel for the Quidnet Association saying exactly that, if not properly conditioned and mitigated. And we have the DEP, we have all of our early references to the absolute importance of hearing from the DEP, and again, he's referencing, I was going to count up how many times it was mentioned, you need to hear from them. And when we heard from them, and in their letter they say that it's a matter of, the 4 geotubes at that time would be appropriate, and it's a matter of having it be properly mitigated. So I'm just stumbling on this.
That letter was for an emergency certificate. They didn't actually talk about the performance standards in that letter?
I'm stumbling on the any sort of convincing that the weight of the material before us is that there definitely will be adverse impacts. And I'm just quickly reading here, so one must keep in mind that while the geotubes have the effect of a seawall when placed on a bank, will cause that beach to narrow and eventually disappear. Erosion could be increased at the ends, and the wall will eliminate the natural sediment supply that would come to the beach through erosion of the bluff behind the wall. And I think we're all there. I think we're unanimous on those points, other than adequate and proper mitigation.
I think we all saw how inadequate the mitigation would be if there was a 3-day nor'easter, because we saw what took place with a 1-day storm, and that basically...
This winter you're talking about?
Yeah. And quite apart from the fact that, I mean, it's clear that the replenishment sand being used is nowhere like the consistency of the material that would be released from the bluff. It's basically pure sand. The bluff is anything but pure sand. So, but, you know, basically all the sand that was available on the geotubes was released in that first day. So then you would go for another 2 days in a 3-day storm with no further sand being released unless the tubes broke, which they might well do. But it still doesn't mimic what would be...
mimic, which is not the standard, of course, mimicking. There's nothing in the standards about mimicking.
When we're talking, actually there is. And there's that an adverse impact, one of the definitions is if it isn't releasing the similar material to the littoral drift, which...
that might be our own fault, though. We always seem to, on all these projects, to require a close match to the sand on the beach. And the sand on the beach has already been cleaned, so it really isn't, you know, we never asked to match the, you know what I'm saying?
Well, we have asked that.
Yeah, so.
And we just had a permit released the other day that had more of a closer match over on the North Shore and for that one property off of in the harbor. We asked them to do 2020.
You're right.
Yeah.
On that particular one. I do know that we have on other occasions, though, you know, matched the beach sand more than, say, the
we
bank
can ask for
sand.
whatever we want to, right?
Yeah. It just seems more realistic to match a bank
I would
sand
add
than
the
beach sand.
the sand composition and makeup is something that the commission could certainly condition whatever makeup of nourishment material that they feel best protects the performance standards, whether it's, you know, 20/20/60 or however it is. I mean, that's something that we condition. I mean, that's not something where you're re-engineering a project. Is you're changing a nourishment component to include a certain mixture that, from the evidence we have, would better replicate maybe what's coming out. So that would be an example of something that to
That would be a
explore.
reasonable alternative, yeah.
Well, and there's multiple reasonable alternatives. So there's two things with the performance standards to achieve whether there's any reasonable alternatives, and we voted that we, in fact, could envision those, whether that's the 2 bags and the 2 jute above, whether it's all jute, all biodegradable, whether it's 3. I mean, we're not here to re-engineer it.
Right.
Our task with this in front of us is to establish, is there a reasonable alternative that will cause less adverse impacts and less damage? You're already impounding the bank by
Right.
putting that there. We want to be able to release sand when we need it. And then so that's the reasonable alternatives approach, and I think that we can also demonstrate, or that we can demonstrate that the applicants didn't prove to us that there wouldn't be adverse impacts. And you could argue that it's not been there for a long time, but the fact that the beach has already sunk down in front of it, that we could see it exposed in multiple storms, that we've already got a little bit of erosion happening behind it, a little bit of scour happening underneath the scour apron. We had areas that we could see behind it where it was getting exposed. And the fact that we've had testimony from 2 to 3 very reputable, actually more than that, folks. One of the ones that we got actually pointed to textbooks where geotextile tubes have been shown to act like a seawall.
When not properly mitigated.
It doesn't say that in the textbooks. It doesn't say when not properly. Yeah.
And if you look at the examples of original mitigation there.
But you can't
It's just
properly
the
mitigate.
letter we just had here. It cited those three to use that as evidence. It cites those 3 points.
So-
But it doesn't talk, but it's all absent any mitigation.
But the
But
philosophy.
What we did hear from the DEP, what we did hear from the DEP was it's all about mitigation.
And I think the flaw in the mitigation is that it's loose sand on the beach, and like Ian was saying, we had one storm this winter where there was really any meaningful northeast component or east component, and it was pretty short, and it was not.
And all that sand goes.
And that
And
sand
it's
was
all
gone.
in the littoral cell as it's been described.
But, and I think Jim O'Connell pointed out that that's a flaw in this form of mitigation, because that release, as the sand is being released and entering the system, it attenuates wave activity. And so if it's all gone at once, it's in his opinion, it will have a different effect than if it's coming into the system over time. Like if you just are hitting the bank, then, every time a big wave comes in, some sand comes out. If it takes 3 days, it takes 3 days, but they're still hitting the bank and removing sand. Where what I think we'd see on this project is with the major storm, within the first probably few hours, most of that mitigation sand is going to be gone. And as Sarah was
It's going to be
alluding to,
suspended, it's going to be out there we don't know where it's going to be. It's going to be in the littoral system.
You don't have more sand provided over time. When that first set of waves comes in, let's say in the first 6 hours, you remove all your mitigation sand, you've got another 48 hours of storm.
All that sand goes immediately to Squam.
No, we're not saying,
where it goes.
it's in the littoral system, it's right there in the waves, it's nearby, it's
So it's
going
right,
north,
so it's in the system.
but there's no more. In other words, if I ask you for ice cream and you give me 2 licks and
No,
say
no,
that's
let's
it,
talk let's not talk
then there's
about
more
ice
ice cream coming there.
Let's go.
There's not enough sand
Let's
there.
keep it in the littoral system.
And part of the issue is outside of the littoral system and how much sand is out there. If that sand gets taken away, almost immediately or within 1 day, and you have a 3-day storm, once that sand is taken, then that geotube is now acting as a hard seawall surface. So
For
the
the
walls that are
duration of
hitting it, are, the waves that are hitting it are refracting off of it. That's helping with the beach lowering and the scouring back behind. So you kind of have a system that maybe at first it's acting as a buffered system with that sand in it, but as soon as that sand is gone, you have that hard seawall, and then you're getting those impacts and those negative impacts of having a seawall
So it
out
seems to
there.
me that we're arguing, that some of us are arguing it both ways, then, because if that sand is out in the system and it hasn't gone immediately to Squam, then it's doing what we say we want to do. It's sort of thrashing around and attenuating and mitigating.
But only
wave
a
action.
small amount of that sand is available. If you've got a 3-day storm, it's going to take 3 days' worth of erosion from the toe of the bluff and from the beach itself. So each time a wave, I think you were describing it well, as a wave comes up, it's going to lift sand, it's going to have sand particles. In fact, Jim O'Connell talked about how fines also attenuate, so not just the coarse sand, but all the different types of material help attenuate those waves.
Right.
When you have a seawall there, you have no help to the toe of that
For that,
bluff
for that-
or to protect the beach
for that period of
for
time.
2/3 of the time of the
Which is what-
storm.
So that's when he came to.
You actually have a magnification.
You have
Because
more than
of
no
that.
help. Yeah, you have a
Yeah,
magnification of the issue.
So, and that's when he came to saying, so it's important to have the right amount there. and he recommended that we get over 20, that we get to 20 yards.
If you read through his
And the
whole
applicant
report
said-
there, I don't think he feels that geotextile tubes are ever a good idea.
He said, we're asking for 3 things, and the applicant said yes, yes, and yes.
One of the things was a model that showed exactly what would happen in the same exact storm with or without geotextile tubes, and it's something that wasn't provided. That was the third thing he
In terms
asked.
of mitigation for the project.
I'm
said
talking
we're
about
asking-
questions he had that weren't answered.
That's, I mean, we did get out there on the 3rd and Saturday at one point, but
I
in terms of saying, in terms of addressing the project potential impacts and the mitigation, he did say it would be useful to have that sort of study. He said, we're asking for, he said, we're not opposed to the project, we're asking for 3 things, and at the next meeting, the applicant said, yes, yes, and yes, we're happy to do those
Okay,
3
so I'm
things.
going to interrupt.
And they left here, and they were going to consult among themselves, the various engineers, and they came back and said, well, we decided not to do that. And so that's sort of, that's what sort of.
We have at least 2 other coastal engineers that also spoke out against these
Those 2 being?
John Ramsey, Trey Ruthven, both coastal engineers, one with Applied, I think they're both with Applied Coastal Engineering, had 10 to 20, 30 years of experience in coastal engineering structures.
Right, and what
They
did
both
Trey-
felt that,
And what did Trey say?
he talked about a variety of issues, one of which he felt this was over-designed, that geotextile tubes were not the right way, that something that's biodegradable would be more acceptable. I've got at least, I know it's in our minutes, and I also have at least one, let's see, letter from the Land Council dated on November 1st, 2003. Talks about each of the alternatives analysis. Jute fiber logs have been shown to work over a number of years, that this is quoting from. In this case, this letter is signed by John Ramsey, professional engineer, and Trey Ruthven, Applied Coastal Research and Engineering. You were talking about having, and I don't know if we want to
You're
beat
on
it.
November 6th?
November 1st. November 1st.
And it's, and their point is,
And their point was, he went through an alternatives analysis, temporary geotube revetment, and he called it a geotube revetment. The scale of the proposed geotube revetment structure appears to be uncharacteristic of the design goals stated below.
this is when it was 4?
No, this is when it's 3.
And the long?
This is the alternatives analysis excludes 2 geotube options that clearly meet the stated design goal more appropriately. This is, you're right, than the selected 4 geotextile tube configuration. Jute fiber logs have been shown to work over a number of years at 79 Baxter Road. A quick glance at any recent aerial photograph shows that the jute logs and terracing have minimized the loss of coastal bluff relative to adjoining loss. This is further confirmed from Epsilon Associates, which shows the bank, and it goes on, it's about 4 paragraphs.
Right, so he gives the opinion that there is that, and then on November 6th, it's on page 3 of the November 6th.
Right, the
meeting.
second excluded option, geotube alternative 2, 3 geotextile tube configuration was the preferred alternative in October 4th submission by MMI. This was the Malone McBroom to the Concom. The 3 geotube alternative eliminates the significant excavation at the coastal beach that is required. They still did excavate the coastal beach and put 1 tube in the beach. To place the 4th geotube below the beach face, which is where it is now, the contractor will have to excavate into the beach approximately 10 feet in depth and greater than 30 feet in width. He was already voting against the one that's in there now that's below the beach. Well, he was expressing his professional opinion that having one in the beach, which was something I think a couple of us mentioned before, was not the best idea. So we have had, from reputable sources, information that shows that the seawall acts, this geotextile tube acts as a seawall once that mitigation sand is away, taken away in a storm. And in any typical storm, it's going to be
No, I think
gone.
we're all there when
So you would agree that
gone,
it's going to
gone.
cause, yeah, it's going to cause inverse.
It's going to be, well, we can agree that it's going to be, I don't know if it's going to cause adverse impacts, because where I'm stumbling is all of that sand, whatever the volume is, where we end up on what the volume of mitigation sand is in front there, that is all now.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Now that is part of the littoral cell, littoral system these guys are all describing. It's there, whether it's going to squam, whether it's going to...
But that's only a portion of what normally would be there. That's what we're saying.
This is where the DEP is saying it comes down to the amount, is what I'm getting.
There's not enough to make up, unless you built a whole, 400-foot, I mean, I'm saying that you can't put enough mitigation, and actually, we've talked about that several times. There's no way to provide enough sand down in front of those things that's going to act as the toe of the bluff would.
Because it just disappears, that loose sand disappears quickly, and if I remember right, and Dirk Van Loo may have to correct me on this, or Sharon, that what happened on this beach was that during that one nor'easter that we had, that it eroded enough of the beach to expose some of the anchor tube on the scour apron. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, let's keep the discussion at the table.
Well, I just want getting clarification. I'm trying to remember. I thought I read that in there.
I can verify that that is correct.
Yeah.
And what that means is that then, if the mitigation sand is gone and it's eroded the beach enough to be down to mean low water, I think that thing was buried to, then wave run-up is going to be much more severe because we don't have the beach profile to slow the waves. And then if that scour apron's exposed, then it's running on a plastic surface instead of on beach sand. And then I think it's going to have more energy when it hits those tubes, which would probably exacerbate in scour. And this is speculation, but I'm going to have to say that everything we're dealing with on this hearing, no matter who says it, is to some degree, if not outright speculation, which I don't think it is, but it's extrapolation from other sites, other experiences. But nobody's got measurements of what's going to happen with this on this beach. The SPPF and the town's engineers were...
All right, that's what Mr. O'Connell was saying, have a lot more transects to monitoring, and if the adverse impacts occur, if this commission decides the adverse impacts are there, out it comes.
And in his paragraph right above that, he says, while the geotubes may have a longer life expectancy, they have a greater potential adverse impact to beaches and dunes than biodegradable alternatives. While we appreciate the intent of having more time to develop long-term alternatives, the use of core, he goes on to say, has been shown to be successful in the short term along the eastern shore of Nantucket and will expedite the long-term alternative planning process. In other words, give us enough time to move that road. Geotextiles are also known to have a higher wave reflection factor than porous biodegradable area. Thus, although the applicants reduce wave reflection as much as possible by reducing the geotube revetment slope, fronting beach erosion may be higher with geotextiles such as geotubes than porous biodegradable air. We've had tons of evidence. I mean, I don't have any.
Tons, but we'll have different. We're going to have different.
Yeah, but we've had reputable people who've been doing this a long time.
All right, so
and we've observed it with our own eyes.
Mike, one thing that I would ask
do you mind
Commission-
letting Sarah finish, please? You interrupt her probably almost every time you've interrupted her. So would you please let her finish?
Thank you. That was nice. I appreciate that. Well, all I was saying is we've also observed this with our own eyes. I mentioned last week that I think it's close to impossible for them to provide the mitigation sand in front of the area where it needs to be for the time. I'm not saying it's their fault. I'm saying in a storm, once that sand is gone, you've got geotubes. And we voted last week that we found reasonable alternatives, so now I would think that we would need to vote if we think that there are adverse impacts, and then we can go through the performance standards and evaluate them. And whether it's alternative or alternatives, I think there are more than one alternative. But that's how we evaluate a project. Are there lesser ways to protect to the greatest ability we can and do the least amount of harm to the environment? That's in our regulations and each and every performance standard, and we should evaluate it.
Are you finished?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman. So, that was on November 6th. We had that opinion that there was potential for adverse impacts. And then we had Mr. Posner saying that at 77 Baxter Road, in response to that business vote, at what was going on, that he had watched Mr. Weimar's Jew, and that they're not always effective. If they were, and Mr. Chairman, this gets into the business of the engineering and doing the engineering, and we have an engineer coming in and saying, in his opinion, it's over-designed, but we don't have an alternative suggested from him. And the stamped engineer's plan we have, the engineers for the project, have said this is where the math takes us. And I don't know if we have evidence that it doesn't. And we had a moment on that last week when we talked about, we can circle back, that they're not always effective. So we know that we have 5 feet to go before the road has to be condemned. And if they were, that would be the project. There can't be any additional failure. These bags have to be rebuilt after every storm. It isn't once or twice a year they are built. If they aren't, there is no protection. When he couldn't rebuild them in time, he lost everything that had been saved over 10 years in one day. It's not about the cost. The driver is that the jute doesn't work. I would offer a motion to the commission, and we can leave it. I'd just like to have a clear record. And my motion would be that the commission finds that testimony and information credible.
Can I?
Well, in what regard? That he's an engineer, so he
Yeah.
had...
My motion would be that the commission finds that information credible.
Can I bring up something that his engineer, Burnham, brought up in the exact same meeting? When we asked him about it, we talked, this was in the minutes that Jeff provided the other day. I think this is on the 7th or 8th page, November 6th meeting. We talked to Burnham.
Which page are you on?
I'm in the minutes that Jeff gave us from November 6th. This should be the second page, second comment. And I'm reading off of my notes, not the minutes, but I can pull it up. We were questioning their engineer, whose last name is Burnham, talking about failure criteria and asking him specifically about the jute bags versus the geotextiles, because we've had this concern.
I'm sorry, you're reading the minutes, you're not reading the minutes.
I'm reading my notes. I can pull up the minutes or get a copy of the
Just go
minutes.
ahead and read that.
Yeah. These are my notes. I'm printing this right off of this. Burnham said, when we asked him how effective are the jute bags and the core bags, he says they are effective as long as they are annually rebuilt. This is similar to what you just said, with an increased cost to the town. This is about risk management and to minimize maintenance.
And I'll just add to this discussion is that the 2 times I mean, those bags do deflate and they do need to be repaired. But, you know, and I'm just speaking from my memory, and I'm not down there every day, but the 2 times I've seen really dramatic failures down there were not this immediately past winter, but 2 winters ago when it was, you know, an extreme winter that, you know, according to the applicants, took out 30 foot of bank in places and took out the jute bags and eroded a bunch of Mr. Weimar's bank. The other time I remember those bags totally failing was maybe 10 years ago or so when the previous design was set up of just the stacked core bags, sand-filled core bags that all deflated and washed into picking up core all over the island, and the terracing fell down. But those were 2 extreme winters as far as storm intensity, and we don't see those every year. And again, we're looking at, and still in my opinion, a project that needs to be in place for maybe 5 years. You know, I mean,
So we're weighing
odds.
the potential for adverse impacts against the potential for what you're describing, the project failure
Or
to take
adverse
place, which
impacts,
we've seen
yeah.
happen a couple of times.
What-
I'll just ask to vote whenever we're ready. I'd ask to.
Okay,
Well-
but, you know, we did have this discussion before, where the feeling from the commission was that it was inaccurate to describe the coir as it dissipates sand and then collapses as a failure environmentally. It may be a failure from the point of view of Mr. Posner and SBPF and Mr. Weimar in terms of protecting their property, but in terms of protecting
Exactly,
the
or a failure.
environment, if I may finish, all right, you know, that would not be considered a failure by other people.
And can I?
Not an environmental failure, but a failure of the project to perform as designed.
Well, and Mike, I don't think in either of those situations they had the same amount of mitigation, the 22 cubic linear feet of cubic yards per linear foot of mitigation. on the core of jute. We have not seen an application in front of us in which you have the same amount of sand available before it reaches the jute. The thing I like about the jute in the core is it does deflate, just like a crumple zone on a car, and it actually deflates when it needs to and releases sand at the moment it's needed. So it provides, even though it has to be repaired, that's not a failure. And I would agree with Ian that even though it has to be repaired and replaced, that's not necessarily a failure because it did its job, just like your bumper on your car does its job when it crumples up. You don't call it a failure. You're happy it crumples because it takes that energy. Done. I'm trying to do a hard stop.
Give me a signal, yeah.
Yeah, a little.
So I don't want to
Yeah.
interrupt, but I can't.
Okay, so let's, if we're going to say is
I don't think we should.
testimony credible, that's not a very precise statement, I'm afraid. I mean, I can't say that he's not a credible person because he is a trained engineer, but I still think...
Posner?
No.
That's who he's talking about.
Oh.
Yeah.
I'm just saying we find Mr. Posner's credible, yes or no? And I'd just like the commission to decide that. And I
don't
believe
think we
I have a
should
right
vote
to ask
on
that
each.
question, so
I
let's
feel
get
if we
decided.
did that, we'd have to go through and vote credibleness to every single person that stood up and
Anything
presented
that any
before us,
commissioner
which
wants to vote, I think that's
seems a little
true.
bit inappropriate.
Shall I put the motion myself to the commission, Mr. Chairman?
Well, you've already put the motion in. Well, okay.
We don't have a second.
No, I'm not going to second it.
I'm not going to second it.
We can
Doesn't need to
vote
be
without a
seconded
second.
under our rules of procedure.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, there you have me, Mike.
Okay.
So just going to ask the commission to decide, and we'll have a yes or a no to it.
I guess the question I would ask then, do we consider Josh Posner the credible witness in engineering?
Well,
Mr. Chairman, the
It's not
question
wise
is,
to-
the motion is, the commission finds that testimony that I read credible. All those in favor, please say aye.
I think it's a credible point. I mean, if your
All
blood
those
starts are...
opposed, say no.
I just don't want to box
Well,
ourselves into
I-
something like this.
I don't care the consequences. The motion carries by
It's a
2 in
credible
favor
observation.
and no other votes.
Only if
All
you
right.
find failure.
we're getting a little far afield.
Okay, so let's
We've
have
got
a vote.
Pucci.
Oh, wait, hold on. Before we take a vote, I'm going to interrupt a little bit. I think it's also been, it's important to note, it's been standard practice of the commission as far as all the way back from presenting to current, that I think everyone generally regards everyone that presents information in front of the commission as being credible for the information that they're presenting. I mean, I think there's a general assumption that people aren't going to stand up in front of the commission and blatantly lie, and that they're going to be presenting information, whether it's Mr. Posner presenting an anecdotal case of what he witnessed as a neighbor to Mr. Weimar, or whether it's Nicole Burnham from Malone and Broom presenting her opinion as an engineer and representing engineering data, whether it's Mr. Rogovine or Mr. Cohen representing their client there. I think we generally assume that everyone is providing information that they feel is honest and truthful. I mean, I think, well, we could take the vote. I think the general practice of the commission is to assume that all information provided is credible and based on the merits that it has, not that we're trying to single out and call someone not credible or not truthful or a liar. I mean, that's the point of the public hearing, is to get to that the information is credible that's on the record. And I think that that's being completed, and if it's part of the discussion, I think that it has to generally be assumed to be credible information.
It's not fair to single any person out or any speaker in front of the commission that's presenting any evidence, PowerPoints, letters, opinions.
I mean, just the information they're
Everything,
providing.
it's all been provided, and we take that at face value.
The motion stands.
Okay, so all in favor?
Those are credible points. Credible.
Well, a credible point's different than a credible witness. But yeah, we're saying everything that's presented to us is credible, and that they
Yes,
believe that
and
they are
that's what
presenting in
And that's what I'm...
their intent,
Yeah.
that they're intending to present what they feel is the truth.
Okay, all in favor?
I'm abstaining.
Okay, opposed?
This is crazy.
Yeah, this is,
I'm abstaining as it's inappropriate.
I'm abstaining because it's
I'm
inappropriate.
abstaining.
Okay.
So that motion carries with Commissioners Carberg, Okai, Steinhauer, Golding, and Lafarge abstaining.
I think-
For point of order, Bam's not voting.
Yeah.
No,
I'm
BAM's
not
not
voting.
eligible.
Yeah.
BAM is not eligible to vote.
Yeah,
I'm abstaining, but if I were voting, I would abstain. Something like that.
but we didn't try to.
I think town council has it.
Did you
Yeah.
recognize this?
Yes.
Yeah, Bam shouldn't,
Be sitting.
he's sitting at the table, but he's not
Right,
participating.
he's not participating, that's correct.
So he wouldn't take part in
Yeah,
that
he
vote.
wouldn't take part in the vote.
Yeah.
And I would just specify, I'm not thrilled about this procedure. I don't know where you came up with that procedure originally about not seconding motions. I know that you don't do that because I was corrected by HDC. I was before Historic District Commission, and I was looking for a second to a particular motion, and they told me that you don't, the rules of procedure that they follow do not require a second, and I'm assuming
Yeah, I didn't know that
Wacky
either.
is correct that you don't require a second for motions that are being made. So if that's true, then really your only option is to vote on the motion. If you are abstaining, you have that right to do that. And I would, in this particular case, it is appropriate for you to state the reason why you're abstaining, that you're objecting to the way the motion is posed. Or you could simply abstain without specifying the reason. But under these circumstances, I think it's appropriate for you to state the reason that you're abstaining on the motion. And that was the only reason I gave my opinion about having a procedure that you don't require motions to be seconded. It presents exactly this type of problematic scenario. It's helpful to have a procedure that when a motion is made, it's seconded, and then there can be either discussion on the motion or then the vote. And if it doesn't get seconded, then it doesn't get acted on.
Yeah, we've had motions fail here for lack of a second at the Concom in the past, in the recent past. But is that true? Is Mike correct? And I don't know.
it's
I
been
don't
the-
know.
I've seen it before. I'll put it to you that way.
But we don't have anything.
So having
Well-
said that, assuming that that is your procedure, and
I don't think
frankly, I
we've
just
ever
don't know
voted.
the answer to that, that you don't require a second. If you don't, then it's appropriate to abstain on the motion and state the reason that you're abstaining. And then you would know in the record what the vote was on the motion.
Is that something we should, do we have anything in writing? I simply don't know.
It's in the
We've been through it before.
It's in the committee guidelines, and the committee guidelines refer you to Robert's rule and the absence of any other rule.
It's in Robert's Rules of Order.
In the committee guidelines, the town of Nantucket Committee and Commission guidelines say you use Robert's rules in the absence of any other adopted established rule. And it is in Robert's rules, so that's the way it is.
But we don't know if we have an
Does it
adopted.
require a second or not?
Not required.
Not to require a
Okay,
second.
So,
It's,
but that's not the only issue. Then the issue is, do you follow Robert's Rules of Order on your procedures? If you
Yes.
do,
Yeah, the town, that's by town
Okay.
guidelines.
then you
That's a
don't
good-
require a second, and my opinion stands that in this case, then, if you're abstaining, I would state the reason for your abstention, then just note what the vote was on the motion.
Okay. Does anybody wish to state their reasons?
Oh, Jen did.
Just that I thought it was an inappropriate motion, particularly based on what Jeff had said earlier as far as how we view all testimony as.
It's my abstention is it's a redundancy. We view all testimony as presented in good faith.
Yeah, and I feel it would tend to give extra weight to one particular person's, because now we've said, oh, this person's credible, we've made a motion and voted that this person's credible, but we
We'd have
haven't
to
made
vote
a
for-
motion that said everybody's credible. And
We'd have to go through each person that's presented in front of us and give them that same recognition or not.
I abstain because I consider it nebulous and irrelevant.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so, I think we're going around in circles.
We
on
should go
these
back to the
22.
performance
Yeah,
standards.
Let's start with performance standards and start working.
And if
through
you
them.
do have something to hand out, I mean, what should we? Do you guys feel like looking at what Jeff has drafted? Does that help? It sometimes helps me, but if you'd rather do it
it's kind of a
cold from
terse,
today,
it's kind of a terse summary. I mean, a lot of the things that are in there will need to add some background for, or some findings on where you guys decided those things. it's kind of a general order, but if you guys would feel it helpful, you can certainly.
It might be, as far as just ordering our thoughts and discussion, but that's just my opinion. I can go either way. You guys,
Well,
what do
I
you think?
think we should just start, we kind of started on coastal beaches and never really, we just got
Yeah.
sidetracked.
And we're going with the 310 CMR with the, would you like to do local regs first, or?
Well, they're pretty, I mean, they tend to mimic each other for the most part.
Okay, so where would you like to start?
So, Mary, I would like to know, are we going to come back to adverse impact at some point?
I think
Well,
we
I think if we go
should.
through performance standards, this is our chance to actually relate adverse impacts to performance standards, which I think we really should do.
So is that a copy of the performance standards that Jeff gave you?
Oh, yes, do you have an extra one?
Yep, I gave one to you already.
Well, it's basically our regulations, times when a waiver is justified, importance of each of them, and performance standards, yes. So the first page is land under the ocean. 1 through 8 for land under the ocean get continued into coastal beaches, is that right?
Well, just real quickly, when you're looking at the state regulations, there's a couple important findings to make through there, and you'll see them. They're the text that's all in caps that kind of are in front of some of the numbered areas. So if you're looking at land under the ocean, which is the back of the first page, that 1025, you'll see that in all caps where it says, when land under the ocean or nearshore areas of land under the ocean are found to be significant to the protection of marine fisheries, protection of wildlife habitat, storm damage prevention, or flood control, 310 CMR 1025, 3 to 7 shall apply. So what you really need to do to start into those sections is you guys will have to actually find that that's the case. In this case, that land under the ocean or nearshore areas of land under the ocean are significant to the protection of, as it relates to this project.
Yeah, I was just looking at the definition because they do include nearshore areas of land under the ocean. Would that qualify here for this? It's the definition's right above that. Nearshore areas of land under the ocean, I don't know, I'm just asking. Means that land extending from the mean low water line to the seaward limit of a municipality's jurisdiction, but in no case beyond the point where the land is 80 feet below the level of the ocean at mean low water.
I mean, there's no aspect of the project that's directly being constructed as land under the ocean. The reason why I include it is I know our local performance standards reference back into the regulations that are there. However, it is a project that is designed to specifically discharge material into the area below mean high water and mean low water.
So it impacts
It's there
land.
for discussion. It's
Well, and we,
you would be within at least the zone or buffer or realm to at
The
least discuss those
erosion,
impacts.
I mean, absolutely impacts land under the ocean, and specifically 1025 1B, distribution of sediment grain size. Clearly, the sediment grain size from the geotube project differs from the sediment grain size that would be released if the geotubes weren't there. So I would say it has a bearing.
I mean, it's something I know from the discussions the commission had. One of the great concerns, I don't want to say great concerns, but one of the concerns that was had in the discussion was the potential impacts of this project as it related specifically to the fisheries habitat that was offshore with the cobble bottom and those things, and those are contained within land under the ocean. So while I don't think that, I mean, obviously the resource areas under direct impact would be coastal bank, coastal beach, and land subject to coastal storm flowage, that given the fact that our local regulations tie back in and there's a possibility of permitting a structure that's going to be discharging into land under the ocean with sand and sediment, that to at least have the discussion of those performance standards is probably a good idea.
We would for a stormwater drain or anything like that. So in the all caps, when land under the ocean or nearshore areas of land under the ocean are found to be significant to the protection of marine fisheries, protection of wildlife habitat, storm damage prevention, or flood control. I would say at least 2, if not all of those, are true here.
We would need to.
True, are accurate. I do, in my opinion, this project and how it could potentially affect land under the ocean or near, that part of the beach and that part of the land under the ocean that's nearby is in fact significant to the protection of marine fisheries. It's a healthy habitat. If you had a dead, dredged, harbor there, then this
Right,
might
the
not
other-
apply.
the other- You're saying two interests?
Pardon, I would say at least protection of marine fisheries, protection of wildlife habitat. It depends on how you define wildlife. Most people say
Yeah.
gray seal habitat, ducks,
I think
plovers.
what you need to do then, when you start digging in, especially to the state, is not to
Find the
get the
whole
cart before this. Is the commission would need to find that those things are significant in this case.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and then you would start from reading through the performance standards that apply. So when you get to bank, it's the same thing. You have to find that it's a bank that's a sediment source, or a bank that's for storm damage prevention, or both. And then there's the applicable performance standards. But you need to make that finding that resource area is significant to.
And I think it is
these
for
cases.
everything listed here, unless I'm wrong. Does anyone else feel like any of those things it's not?
Is not significant?
Yeah.
I certainly,
You think it's all?
I think it's significant. And I think this may be, oh, no, wait, excuse me.
So if we,
Well, if there's nobody, is there a motion to find?
I'll make a motion to find that on this page 61, this is 310 CMR 1025 land under the ocean, under section 2, finding when land under the ocean or nearshore areas of land under the ocean are found to be significant. My motion is that the impacts of the project area, the discharge from this project area and the nearshore area that could be impacted are indeed significant to the protection of marine fisheries, protection of wildlife habitat, storm damage prevention, or flood control, and that because of that, 310 CMR 1025 3 through 7 shall apply. And then we go through 3 through 7, and I guess we should have a,
So is there a second to Sarah's motion?
Can I make a quick comment, though?
Sure.
I mean, any project we put down on there that has nourishment is going to have that effect.
right, and then that just means we have to go through the performance
Okay, I'm
standards and,
just pointing it out, that
yeah.
We typically do that.
Yeah, this is usually,
About land
I
under
just want to make that sure.
yeah, this is a performa, and then we would say does,
Understandable.
yeah,
I
yeah.
understand.
But if you don't think
Yeah.
it's going to...
No.
Yeah, okay.
I agree.
But this is land under the ocean only.
Yeah,
Right,
we're just
yeah.
going through it piecemeal
Yep.
Yep.
to try to be thorough.
Do I have a second to Sarah's motion?
Yes.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that motion carries unanimously.
Okay, and then the first one is to do with improvement dredging for navigational purposes, which is not being done. So that's number 3.
Maintenance dredging, which is next.
Yep, we're not doing number 4, maintenance dredging. Number 5, projects not included in the last 2, 3, or 4, which affect nearshore areas of land under the ocean shall not cause adverse effects by altering the bottom topography so as to increase storm damage or erosion of coastal beaches, coastal banks, coastal dunes, or salt marshes.
Where are you?
Number 5. So they say if it's not 3 or 4, which are both dredging, which are designed to alter bottom topography or bathymetry, then number 5 is the very next one. I'm just trying to be thorough and go through each one. So this basically says if it's not a dredging project, it should not, which affect nearshore areas of land under shall not cause adverse effects by altering the bottom topography so as to increase storm damage or erosion of coastal beaches, dunes, or salt marshes. Even though this is probably an open thing, I don't think we have any obvious proof that this is going to necessarily, I don't know, what do you guys think as far as, the sand is going to change the bottom topography, but I don't think we can definitively say that it's going to increase storm damage and land of the ocean.
And land under the ocean.
I think it does in the beach and the bank, but I don't think, but I'm open to,
Well, the definition of, in the town regulations of an adverse impact means a greater than negligible means a greater than negligible change in the resource area or one of its characteristics, functions, or factors that diminishes the value of the resource area to one or more of the specified interests of the town of Nantucket Wetland Protection Bylaw.
But we'll get to that.
That's number 6, though. I think that's, yeah, no,
Well,
I
we're
agree with
That's
you.
adverse impact, you agree?
Yeah,
Five that you quoted from has adverse effects.
right.
So I thought it was relevant to read what adverse impact or adverse effects actually were considered.
Right.
And I also have another definition, a legal definition, which I'd like to read later. But I would like to finish, and as basically the last sentence is, negligible means small enough to be disregarded and shall be defined in relation to the wetland resource areas impacted. So I think it's really trying to prove a negative. We don't know. And so I would prefer to err on the side of caution.
So you're suggesting that we find that it will affect,
Bottom topography as to increase storm damage or erosion of coastal beaches. I mean, one way it could is if you put too much sand into the system and it's heavy sand and it doesn't go where the sand is from the bank and it stays right there, it actually shallows the area right in front of that and gives waves a head start.
Excessive mitigation. Excessive mitigation.
I'm just saying, I'm asking Ian if he feels like this is going to change the topography in a way to increase storm damage or erosion of coastal beaches.
I think
Thanks.
certainly in a
the
three-day
nat-
storm,
by
it's going
affecting
to.
the natural replenishment of beaches. I think we would argue that. But is that because of,
I mean, we know what it's going to do to the coastal beach,
Mm-hmm.
but land under the ocean, I think, is vaguer.
yeah, I think that's kind of,
I think it's
yeah.
purely speculative. I think you're kind of
Yeah, I
getting
think
into
it
it.
is, yeah.
Yeah.
Gray area here.
Right.
I mean, I think that part of the problem is we are dealing with the project that is not in land under the ocean.
Can we set 5 aside, maybe, and discuss 6 and
I-
7? And
I think
come
with
back?
5, real quick, if I may,
Yeah.
I think when you want to look at it, when you're evaluating, is you want to look at, is the project designed as such to minimize the chance, or, is the mitigation volume sized correctly as to minimize that chance? You're not going to, you need to consider the project design with that for whether if it's, I guess the example is, if the project is designed to replicate the loss or the erosion of what would naturally be occurring on the beach and the bank, then that project is designed to not have that adverse effect that you're trying to prevent? I mean, you have to take that into account. I know it's kind of tricky to build that in, to say, when they designed the project, were they designing it to minimize that, to eliminate that? Did they disregard the adverse effects from that? I think it's important to think of the design of the project with that and not just the standard itself, by itself. Because that one's kind of tricky, especially because it's
Yeah, I
under
think
the
things
ocean.
like 6 and stuff, I mean, there are other things under the ocean that I think are more likely to be adversely affected, but I'm not positive on 5.
It
It's,
seems like
You'd have-
6D,
well, I think we have lots of issues in 6, but 5's a tough one, because I agree it's kind of speculative. I mean, you could argue that because this is unconsolidated sand put on top of a geotube, that it's going to erode in a different manner and change the nearshore topography. I mean, I think that first half of the sentence is possible. Now, whether that actually increases storm damage or increases coastal erosion of coastal beaches, I mean, I think there is going to be increased erosion of the coastal beach, but I don't know if that's directly from the topography change,
on the ocean, yeah.
or if it's just because of the refraction and reflection, and I'm trying to be very fair and honest here.
I think and I promise I'll leave my opinions out after
No,
this one.
no, no,
I think it's important to also remember too, when we're looking at this project, you're not looking at the project's impact by itself in the system, but it's important to remember in some cases that, especially when you're dealing with a littoral system, that a lot of the sand and things that are in the water are not necessarily coming from the coast. They're also coming from offshore resources, offshore bars, transport up and down the coast, that the impacts to that nearshore area are not solely from, even if no project decided, not just solely from there. So it gets very tricky when you're trying to
Ian's
weigh
point,
that out.
do we I don't know if we can definitively say that it's not causing an adverse effect. No.
Well, this is where conditioning comes into the play with these performance standards. So this is where, when you look at that, if you think there could be an effect and you think there's a way to condition a project as such to bring it into compliance with that performance standard, for sure. Like if you said, we would want monitoring transects to extend that 80 feet out onto the water.
But we don't believe, I mean, the whole reason we're talking about a denial is because we can't, at least I, do not believe that enough mitigation and conditions can be put into place
Right.
that allows this project to be built as proposed.
Exactly, but I think part of that exercise is also, and we've done this before for other denials, is when you're looking at performance standards, is there a condition that's reasonable that you can put on that brings it into compliance? And when you get to the end, if there are still ones you cannot, then it's clear. But if there are ones that you could condition, then I think part of the analysis that you guys have to do, and especially for applicants or for the public, is to say that concern could have been better alleviated because we
This
could have
way.
conditioned it by saying we need information or bathymetry out to, and I know part of the, in this case, part of the monitoring protocols includes transects that extend into the water to some degree. If that's not sufficient, that's where the conditioning would come in. But that way, everyone knows what the thought is there. When they look at that standard, they can say, this is how we need to address it.
But, and I do recall us asking throughout the many months that we've been discussing this for some information about the nearshore topography, and I'm not sure we got.
I have to go through again off the top of my head. But that's,
I see what you're saying. In other
This is
words,
an
in order
example
to
of-
evaluate how it's not fitting the performance standards, you have to think of how it would. It's
Correct.
like a reverse psychology.
right, so this is where our conditioning plays in when you look at it and you say, can we put a condition on this performance, or to address this performance standard to alleviate or to bring it into compliance?
I think what he's saying is you see if you can, you look at what's been proposed, what you have in front of you, and you see if there's a way that it can be permitted according to the standards. And then if you can't get there, then you decide to deny it. But rather than begin with the decision and then try to build a rationale for it.
Yes.
Well, I think that there's plenty of ones where it's obvious that there'll be an adverse impact. I think number 5 here is
And
not.
we should focus on those.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying let's not get tripped up over a speculative thing, because I don't think we can say either way. On this one, I think there's a possibility, but would I say it's definitive? No. But I think there are other areas under coastal banks and coastal beaches where it'll be definitive and easy to address. That's why I'm saying we should skip over this unless you've got
No.
some kind of bright idea.
I just want to be sure that we are thorough. That's what
I'm
here to do.
trying. I've never been so thorough in my life. That's right. Except for my thesis. Okay.
Well, I think if we go to number 6,
Mhm.
where we probably see more. Water circulation,
Should we read these out loud to the people here?
alterations.
So it says, projects not included in 310 CMR 1025-3, which is dredging, which affect land into the ocean, shall, if water dependent, be designed and constructed, you could say this is water dependent, or you could say it's not, but using best available measures so as to minimize adverse effects, and if non-water dependent, have no adverse effects on marine fisheries habitat or wildlife habitat caused by alterations in water circulation, destruction of eelgrass, alterations in distribution of sediment grain size, which I think is definitely a problem, changes in water quality, including but not limited to, other than natural fluctuations in the level of dissolved oxygen, temperature, or turbidity, or the addition of pollutants, or alterations of shallow submerged lands with high density of polychaetes, mollusks, or macrophytic algae, which is large algae. You could argue that E could also apply.
I would just remind everyone that water dependency, both in our regulations, simply isn't implying that water has to touch it. It's simply implied that the project has to be located within a resource area to achieve its goal of the project. So we've discussed that many times. It's the most poorly phrased phrase ever, but
And it's slightly different from the state versus for us, isn't it?
not much.
Not much.
I
And
think this general area has been maybe not so much during this hearing, but in the past, pointed out that this is probably one of the most productive habitats
On the East Coast.
on the, at least in the, New England coast, New York coast area with the cobble habitat out there.
Well,
I was just going to say, so through the reading of that, if this is a water-dependent project, then it has to be designed and constructed using best available measures to minimize adverse impacts, not to have no adverse impacts. So that's the two parts of that of that phrase. So looking at what they've proposed and whether or not it's best available measures to minimize adverse impacts.
And I would argue that they could be minimized more.
Well, again, not to play devil's advocate again, but to do it. But that's also where the board's role of conditioner to the project comes in, because if there are ways through conditions without redesigning the project that you can minimize more, that's what we need to do.
That's why we make everybody go get their sieve analysis on these things so that we can match the mitigation to the sieve analysis.
They did provide sieve analysis, and then the sand that they're putting into the geotextile tubes and on top is not identical to what's on the bank or on the beach. So they did provide that data.
Right, so we could condition it saying it has to be this way, that way.
If that material is actually obtainable.
That's not our problem.
Well, I think we also get back to the whole argument about release rate.
Yeah, I don't think it can be conditioned in such a way
Not
that
without
causes
redesigning the project.
that causes no adverse effects or impacts. I mean,
The
that's,
standard that we need to apply here is which?
To minimize
Minimize.
adverse impacts.
because
excuse
you
me,
would
adverse
say
effects.
this was definitely water dependent.
Yes. Because it cannot be, for this structure, I would say that it cannot be located not on the beach or not on the bank.
Right. No, I would agree.
So that means we do everything we can to minimize in our conditions.
Does that include making them take out the geotubes and put in core bags?
Yeah.
I mean,
It
that's-
certainly includes, and it's part of the presentation, if we find adverse impacts, we can order it out any time. That's part of what's in front of us. That's what's got me so frustrated with this, is that we have the potential for adverse impacts. We all recognize that. If we have them, we order it out. End of story. That's what a reasonable thing
I
has to
think
be.
we're agreeing to disagree, because I personally feel that it's already had an adverse impact in many ways. And not only that, the legal definition of adverse impact, which is use your own property so that you do not injure another's property, is something that has been brought up in an abundance by the abutters. And there we stand. So
Yeah.
You're already there. You've already seen the adverse impact, you're saying.
Yes.
I've seen, yes, and which I consider at this point fairly minimal, but I have no way, that's a personal opinion rather than trying to judge it scientifically.
We're all much closer together than we realize.
Well, and I'm a little confused. I don't understand why we have to write all the conditions for something.
Because that's a...
We can't find that we're issuing this denial because we have found that there is a, even as the project is proposed, we find that there is a significant potential for adverse impacts to land under the ocean, to coastal beach and bank. I mean,
Well, you certainly can.
we could think all day about ways to keep that down to zero or minimize it, but
Yes, we can. I completely agree with you, and I don't want to sound argumentative when I say this, but I guess I always view the role of the commission is to review a project and view it from the lens of trying to minimize its impacts and trying to permit it in the way to have the least amount of impact. And if it can't be conditioned
but
to
we
do
voted
such...
on a denial. This seems like
Say again, please, come here.
Well, and if you can't get there, that's when you deny the project. But I think you need to conduct again, this is just my opinion, you need to conduct the analysis to review the standards to be sure that there's not a way you can condition a project to make it compliant to the regulations. And if you guys are ready to say you don't feel that's the case, then it's your prerogative. But I think going through and being thorough about that decision is important.
Well, I think we tried to do that at one point, and
Well, I'm not being specific enough. Like for number 6, I mean, can I think of exactly all the ways they would need to change this project to make it not affect the offshore area? I mean,
Can
we
we
could.
put conditions on there that would minimize it?
I don't think we
I don't think we can, not with 3 geotubes. I mean, it depends on our definition of re-engineering. If it was all jute and they mitigated with material that was exactly the same as the bank, and that mitigation material, but that's too different from their project. At least that's.
redesigning the whole project.
No, well, if that's what you think. If you don't think you could condition, I'm not saying you have to sit down now and make all of the conditions, but
Well, that's what it sounds like you're saying.
when you're making that decision, I think you also have to at least go through your head and say, what conditions do I think could be on there, or what things will I need to condition to make it comply? And if it's too much, or it's redesigning, or it's those things, then it's clear. I mean, it doesn't have to be a long, drawn out. And I think we need to, match the civ analysis to this and go step by step. If you don't think you can get there, then you can't get there. But that's.
Well, I think a problem I'm having, Jeff, is we just had a big discussion on the failure of the jute bags in an extraordinary year, which took 30 foot of bank, and we're mitigating for 2.8 feet of bank, the average year. If we want to mitigate for 10 times that, 30 foot of bank, instead of putting 22 cubic yards per linear foot, put 220 cubic yards per linear foot, we'll have a mountain out there. There'll be no beach left. It'll be
Horrible
powered-
impacts
yeah.
to the offshore
And
habitat.
so, we're kind of caught in a conundrum here of what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And either way, it's a disaster. That's an issue I'm having. I mean, on the one hand, you can't argue, like their one paper did, that, oh God, it's global warming and sea levels are rising and we're seeing more intense storms, so we need 4 geotubes, which they never really pressed. They dropped that, but they did present that information. And then argue that you need to only mitigate for the average year, which isn't the 100-year storm.
Right, and I guess maybe I'm just not being as clear as I could, is you still have to work within the parameters of the design project. So the project that we're reviewing is a 3 geotube project with 22 cubic yards per linear foot in the configuration that's there. I mean, if you're looking to condition that the sand composition or what that nourishment material is made of without going through the big engineering redo, then you're still okay. I mean, if you're starting to get to, I think what I'm saying is, if you're getting to the point where you think that nourishment value should be 100 cubic yards per linear foot, then you're moving out of the reasonable conditions to allow the project to continue. And that's
I
where
think, yeah,
you don't meet. But if it's things that are within the parameters of the project but can be conditioned to be compliant with the performance standards, that's
Then when we would have asked to work on a positive order. If we felt that it was tweaks that we could make where they could fit the performance standards, then I think that's where we would have headed. For instance, with 6, I mean, for both C and E, I don't think that they can mitigate with the right type of material at the right time in such a manner that you're not going to cause loss of the beach, flanking on either side, and adverse effects to the offshore habitat. I don't think the project as designed can do that, and I don't think we can put conditions on it that would help them. If we put enough conditions to enough mitigation sand, for instance, to protect it, we'd hurt the offshore area.
And we made that point very early in the process, that we thought there would probably be different things they could do that we would not find so many impacts with, and what they come back with the exact same thing. So,
well, that's just, I guess what I'm saying is, if that's what you guys want to find as the commission, then that's what you guys can find. I mean, that's perfectly okay. I mean, if that's the will of the board to find that
Well, that's
that
the
can't
way
be
the
done.
wording is this,
Yeah.
this order cannot be conditioned within the,
Right, it's just,
footprint of
I'll
the
put it this way,
project.
in the order that's there, if we go through and we list off the performance standards that are there, I guess what I'm hoping occurs, that's a new word for everyone today, is that analysis by the commission has gone through to address that performance standard being in the order. I mean, if it hasn't been discussed, I mean, I can copy and, standards that say the applicant has failed to meet the burden of proof all day for all of these things, but if it hasn't been discussed, it's hollow words on a page that we just copied there.
The more we find out, the commission's made up its mind before doing the analysis, and so it doesn't get sticky.
We've been doing this analysis for years.
No, I'm not, again, I'm not trying to drag you guys kicking and screaming into this, but I want to be sure that the words on the page are reflected by the discussion that's had.
Well, and I think for 6,
Please speak for yourself, Mike.
for 6, for these 5 areas, I certainly think that as a water-dependent project, using best available measures, so projects not included which shall be water dependent, be designed and constructed using best available measures so as to minimize adverse effects. For alterations in the distribution of sediment grain size, I don't think that it was designed to minimize adverse effects. And for E, alterations of shallow submerged lands with high density of polychaetes, mollusks, or macrophytic algae. I mean, projects like this can be built in areas like Logan or in parts of industrial areas because you don't have a very important habitat right offshore. And we have to be more careful when there's something that affects stripers and, I mean,
And we basically have no proof to the contrary.
Right.
So that's.
we have no
to the
proof that
contrary.
this is not going to adversely affect this.
No,
We don't have
the
any
problem
testimony.
is that we keep going to the core and the Jude, and we keep going to, they
Which
could
is-
propose something that we've seen fails when the big storms come. With this 5 feet of road fails, not the environmental sense, but fails to do what the project is designed to do, which is to stabilize the bank.
But the
If we lose 5 feet, the road is doomed.
But that's
Michael,
not the,
We have an environmental component to our
Yeah,
mandate.
it's our job to make
it's not just our
Well,
job
it's our
to
job
protect
yes.
property.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. It's to, but where the rub comes in is if doing, for the environmental component, we're saying you can do a project that's doomed to fail. That's not a project, that's not what the standard is. The standard is design a project that uses the best available measures to minimize. And implicit in that is design a project to achieve what you're trying to achieve.
Actually, the standard isn't that cut and dried. So, protecting property is not absolute.
But
I
that,
think we have a disagreement here that
Yeah.
will come out in the vote at the end.
well,
We're
and,
not going to solve this problem today. I mean,
Although the standard
Well,
is perfectly precise.
well, and in this case, we've got a project that's been there for quite some time, a house that's still there, as I recall, and no evidence of severe habitat effects offshore. So that's an obvious alternative to this project that we can see every day. If I was presenting a project or a series of projects or coastal engineering myself, I would show areas offshore in parts around the country and actually provide evidence that there's not been a change in habitat because no fines or cobbles are provided. But in the mitigation sand that they're putting, and they were very clear about what kind of material they were putting there, it doesn't have fines or cobbles. It's not going to keep creating that habitat. It's changing the distribution of sediment grain size. That's very clear, and they were very honest about what the sediment grain size would be and what's in the borrow pits and how that looks. It's presented. We had all kinds of charts. In addition, there is, in my opinion, this is, as designed, does not necessarily minimize adverse effects to the offshore high density of polychaetes, mollusks, or macrophytic algae. If you wanted to talk about other alternatives, not that I necessarily agree, something like there are other things that could be built there that might have less impact on the habitat near shore. There are other things that would have way more impact. If it was a giant nourishment project with hundreds of millions of cubic feet of sand, then that, we've argued in the past, could bury offshore cobble habitats. But at least those two, I think, apply. I don't know if we could say anything about water circulation, eelgrass, Water quality, you're going to increase their turbidity, so you are going to have changes in water quality because of how this stuff erodes and when. But I don't think that's the biggest thing. But could I condition it so that it didn't, it's one of the big things that was mentioned in at least 5, and I'm going on and on, I know, in many, many engineers' reports, including Malone Broom, Burnham, Roberge. This is unconsolidated sand that's from the sand borrow pits. It's not beaches and bluffs. So it erodes differently, and we asked them about how this erodes. And they said, yeah, it's going to erode differently than the bank erodes. That's how that mitigation sand is placed and what it looks like.
Okay, I'm going to say, I think we kind of beat this and moved it to
Yeah, I'm
the
sure.
ground.
So let's go to the next one.
Let's go to 7, and
Okay.
What have we decided then?
we haven't. We're going to, let's look at 7 and kind of complete the land under the ocean thing. Well, I guess we should stick with...
I was just saying with 6 with C and E, I don't think it can be conditioned not to cause, to minimize adverse effects enough, in my opinion. But
Right.
the 7's a very straightforward one.
Yeah, we don't really, as far as we know, rare vertebrates...
There's no, they're not within mapped habitat.
Yeah.
So,
Go to
what
beaches.
would we have a
Well,
motion
actually,
to
I do have a question. How close are the plovers to the access point at Hoyks Hollow?
Pretty much at.
Oh, they're further north. I mean,
They're further north.
they're closer to Sacagawea Pond.
But
Didn't
they're
we
not
have-
land under the ocean. That would be more of a coastal beach thing anyway.
Okay. Good point, excuse me.
So,
I mean, I think Jeff was saying we should just discuss all of them, or do you want a motion for 6?
is that findings?
Do you want a motion for findings? What do you think, Jeff? What's the
I
rest?
think if you guys want to have the discussion and then maybe the draft order, when you guys review it, if the discussion seems to go that way, we'll reflect, and you can kind of do a mass
Well, I think the
findings, but
draft order could easily include,
It would have to be a
6.
double negative, I think, from your point of view.
So 6C and E.
There's insufficient evidence has been shown or demonstrated that it isn't going to have an adverse effect, more than a negligible adverse effect on those components.
I think that's fair to say.
Okay, I think that's, okay, should we go to the town of Nantucket, land under the beach while we're here?
Mm-hmm.
Land under the ocean?
Oh, so we're going to skip ahead to the, that sounds good, so
Is there anything different on,
It's shorter.
it's shorter. This includes piers which aren't part of this, so that's 3 and 4, and 5. And agriculture is 6. So it's,
1 through 6 is not
yeah,
pertinent.
so it's just 7.
I'd say looking
8.
at 7 and 8.
So 7 reads, "No new bulkheads or coastal engineering structures shall be permitted to protect structures constructed or substantially improved after 878."
I think we, to be honest, I think we've covered that one already.
Okay?
That's the alternative question.
Yep.
So we're just looking at 8, and that's the one we just kind of discussed
Okay.
with the state, so.
So 8 is actually worded, I think, a little bit better. "Shall be designed and performed so as to cause no adverse effects." This is actually clearer. "On wildlife, erosion control, marine fisheries, shellfish beds, storm damage prevention, flood control, recreation, and aquatic vegetation."
yeah, I think.
This is stronger than the state's, and I think this is easier without having to use double negatives to say that this is no adverse effects, not minimize adverse effects. So that should be an easy one to write.
If I agree with that.
So we'll go back to coastal beaches for the state.
Okay, beaches.
Was that just a vote?
Well, all
We're
doing
just
now is
discussing
giving
each performance
Jeff guidance
standard.
to write the condition, order.
All right, so again, with coastal beaches with the state, you can see under 2 there, there's a couple sections with the all caps, which kind of requires a finding to happen. So in the coastal beaches case for the state, it's just when a coastal beach is determined to be significant to storm damage prevention, flood control, or protection of wildlife habitat, the following standards shall apply. So you need to find that the coastal beach in this case is significant to storm damage prevention, flood control, or protection of wildlife habitat to apply.
I would say that's a...
If I may, first of all, where it has the definition of a coastal beach, which means unconsolidated sediment subject to a wave, et cetera, we no longer have a coastal beach by definition. We have one that's been impacted by the geotube, which is solid. So part of the beach is consolidated. And so just by definition, putting a geotube there is you've had an adverse impact.
I would agree.
A lot of these,
Part of the beach is no longer a beach.
right.
Right.
Did Jim just take a break?
Should be right back. She's happy with it. I think, while I completely agree with what Ian says, because I think that change in the structure of the beach, Ian, will be addressed a little bit more thoroughly in, just as an example, like if you guys make that finding that the original coastal beach was significant to those things, that when you look at like performance standard number 3 underneath that changing the beach or adding that is probably better covered in that section.
So I think it's fair for this finding, I mean, in this case it says storm damage prevention, flood control, or protection of wildlife habitat. I think it does all 3, but
We
do
only
you
need,
all think it's only 2 of the 3 or
well,
1 of the
you only need one of them to apply the
Okay,
the
well,
standards.
it's
So-
definitely, I think it's
Significant to-
it's significant to storm. This coastal beach is a significant coastal beach that is significant to storm damage prevention, flood control, or protection of wildlife habitat. And I think that's a
It's all
finding.
3, actually.
Yeah,
I think all 3, and especially since we've had testimony that the downdrift deposition was significant.
So do we
Right.
need to have a vote on that finding?
It'd be nice.
Okay, so I move that we make this finding that for 1027, 310 CMR, DP 1027, for a coastal beach that we find that it's determined to be significant to storm damage prevention, flood control, or protection of wildlife habitat. And therefore, 3 through 7 below, which we'll discuss, shall apply.
Do I have a second?
Second.
You in favor?
You don't need seconds.
Yeah.
We established that earlier.
But we like them.
I know, but
That's our
if
practice.
you're going to start enacting them, you're going to have to
Stay
enact
with it.
something overriding
No.
what you already have, so you don't need seconds.
You can't mix them up, I guess.
Oh, we can't just do some and not others.
Yeah, right. I would just follow the procedure you have in place, which
I
is
appreciate
you
it,
have
though, Andy.
Robert's
Thank you.
rules.
So
That's
can
pretty
I
straightforward.
make a motion that we augment
Terry's got
Robert
her hand
rules
up.
by having proposing seconds in the future?
Right, you want to
been
do
writing
that by
it
way
down
of
for years,
regulation.
so-
Oh, by
Don't
regulation?
do it.
Well, we've been doing it both ways.
Okay, no seconds tonight.
Okay.
Yeah.
Terry?
This is just, it's an observation and maybe something town council can answer. The only board that doesn't do seconds is HDC. All the others do seconds, and your practice has always been to do seconds. So I don't know how that would affect, it has been the practice of this board, having taken minutes for a while.
Longer than you care to remember.
So, yeah, so that was why I asked earlier.
We always did do
Because
seconds.
Dirk did show that in Robert's rules, you don't require seconds, and your town bylaw has that you've adopted Robert's rules. So that's your official adopted.
So
We don't require,
We can use seconds.
but we
just
can.
don't have to.
Right.
You can if you'd like, but earlier you did have a motion that didn't have a second. So
Yeah.
if you want to continue following to have seconds, you can do that as your customary practice. However, just keep in mind,
You think we
you
should
cannot
go back-
prevent a vote now.
You can't kill a motion, but with.
You
for
can't
one
kill a
second.
motion that doesn't have a second because you have an official rule in place that doesn't require a second.
So we can
don't
keep
have
what
to have
doing.
seconds.
We don't have to have them, but we can keep doing them.
And I propose also that we keep doing it, and in the situation where you don't get a second and someone wants to push it, then we describe, as town council suggested, why we are abstaining, if we choose to abstain.
Okay, that's a...
Jared?
Can I just say something? The reason HGC does that is because I instituted that, but I learned it from Michael Owacki, because he instituted it here on the Conservation Commission, because we spent a lot of time with Robert's Rules.
We used to agree on a whole lot of things.
And it's that way to expedite the meeting, so that you're not sitting around waiting for somebody to second. You can just take a vote on it if you need to. It doesn't. If somebody says second, it doesn't mean everything comes to a screeching halt. You still just take the vote. It's designed to move things along, not to make things more difficult. Because it isn't going to get a second. You're not going to get a positive vote either.
No, it did. Earlier it did. That motion did get a positive vote, because it didn't get a
it could have
second.
gotten seconded. But Andrew
Actually, you had
could
4
have seconded
abstentions.
as well.
Yeah, but he didn't. So that's the only reason I'm pointing out.
Not to vote, but it doesn't.
You can continue doing it, but I'm just pointing out that you don't have an official rule in place that requires seconds.
I think it's fine if we have seconds, and if we don't, we'll always be willing to listen to
It's a
someone.
preferred practice.
Yeah.
We have a number of habits
All
and
right.
practices.
Let's just-
that we
let's
have.
just-
We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that motion carries unanimously.
All right. While you guys are in finding mode, there's also another finding for this one. That's where we have the. All right. So just for Ian, there's tidal flat means any nearly level part of a coastal beach which usually extends from the mean low water line landward to the more steeply sloping face of the coastal beach, or which may be separated from the beach by land under the ocean. So.
I don't think we have a tidal flat here.
Correct. So we'll need to find then that there's the other one, that when a tidal flat is determined to be significant to marine fisheries or the protection of wildlife habitat, that shall apply. So you could find that there's no tidal flat present, so those don't apply.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that motion carries unanimously. Thank you, Joe.
No problem. I just want to get all the rules in play.
Okay.
So,
So we're saying number
I think we
3.
could say on number 3,
Three.
change the volume of the beach.
So to read it all,
Where are we now?
number 3 under 1027, right under that finding. Any
Coastal beach.
any project on a coastal beach, except under projects permitted above for this A.
Unfortunately, my notes are on a different version of the rules, and so it's different pages.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, it's just right above that finding on page 64. Does that help?
Well, it's page 61 for me, so here we go.
Okay. Well, number 3 says, any project on a coastal beach except any project permitted under 1033A shall not have adverse effect by increasing erosion, decreasing the volume, or changing the form of any such coastal beach or an adjacent or downdrift coastal beach. And I think this does that.
I mean, it changed the volume of the beach because it put a big bag on top of a part of it, so that whole part of the beach is gone.
Mhm.
And there's the idea of increasing erosion by having that GO2 present within the beach itself when the mitigation sand is taken away.
Right, that should very likely increase the erosion.
That's a very straightforward one.
Yeah. No, I got it.
You find it? Okay.
So what page are you on?
I'm on page, my page is 61, that's
Oh,
all.
okay, so you're like 3 pages off.
Yeah, we're at 62, actually, thank you.
Okay. The next one, so do we need to vote on each or every? This is a
I think we're just
no-brainer.
discussing
Any
Yep.
drawings every tier.
We don't have a
We
groin.
don't have those.
And number 5, though, notwithstanding 310 CMR 1027-3, beach nourishment with clean sediment of a grain size compatible with that on the existing beach may be permitted.
So then we get into a big discussion.
Well, that's just part of it that they could do. So,
We could do it, but do we want it to be the same as the beach or the same as the bank? We're not doing.
well, in this case, we're not arguing.
doing beach
applicable.
nourishment.
Yeah, this is.
This isn't a nourishment project, it's a mitigation.
And if it was, we would find that it does comport with 310-27-5.
Well, I think it's one of those, when you look at some standards that it's very possible it could be compliant with the performance
That's what I'm
standard.
saying. I mean, this is the state's performance standard based on best available information at that time.
And I guess that's one, if you look at that, does the applicant demonstrate proof that they're compliant with that performance standard?
Yeah.
That's the question.
The next two, we skip.
So do we want to go do coastal beaches under the town quick?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to do it. And it's combined with 2.02
Yep, it's 2.02.
on page 23, following along at home.
You haven't done it, you are.
Yes. Have a little bouncing ball and caption
All right,
services.
I'm going to jump in. So we've already covered number 1 pretty extensively, and then we've already covered number 2 pretty extensively. Not dredging.
So we can make both of those findings.
Yep, and then 4 is applicable for our discussion.
Are you looking under performance standards?
Yep,
Yeah.
4 is applicable. 5 and 6 are not applicable.
Okay, so 4 is
7 is not applicable.
neither the next
8, 9,
two.
8, 9 are not either. There's no fertilizers in play here.
That's really number 4.
Well, and 10 may impose additional requirements as are necessary to protect the interests protected by the bylaw.
Yeah, that's the catch-all. That's in all of our.
That could be something like scenic views or
Yep. So when we look at our interests,
Something
our,
like what, please?
something like scenic views that aren't mentioned in the ones above that, but is considered part of our findings.
right. So
And 2 above for wetland scenic views.
so the interests you guys are considering here are flood control, erosion control, storm damage prevention, fisheries, shellfish, wildlife, recreation, and wetland scenic views. So.
These findings may be overcome only upon a clear showing that the beach or flat does not play a role in protecting any of the interests given above, and only upon a specific written determination to that effect. So we don't agree, I mean, we do agree that this beach is a significant beach. Yeah.
We're kind of looking at number 4.
Yep. Clean fill of compatible grain size may be used on coastal beach, but not on tidal flat, only if the commission authorizes its use, and only if such fill is to be used for a beach or dune nourishment project. All possible mitigation measures should be taken as determined by the commission to limit the adverse effects of the fill. So that's one of our catch-22s. You want enough material there to provide protection for the geotubes to contribute to the littoral system, but not to cause adverse impacts.
Or Solomon.
Again, I'll jump in. So this is the project designed as it is and what's proposed for the nourishment volume and the sediment type that's proposed to comply with clean fill of compatible grain size used on the coastal beach, but not on a tidal flat, as it says. And then with the local bylaw, the other trick to that is either conditioning or granting of a waiver to these provisions. The state doesn't have waivers, so it takes that out of play. But is the project designed and is the waivers requested not having an adverse impact with no reasonable alternatives for that?
Well, a reasonable alternative would be to provide the fill either through jute, different composition, not at all, not to have the project there, or are we saying that they're, the best possible mitigation measures were proposed?
Well, this basically says that fill of compatible grain size may be used on a coastal beach only if such fill is to be used for a beach or dune nourishment project.
Since this isn't that,
That isn't that, so.
we could just say this isn't applicable?
Well, I think,
I don't know, I'm asking. I'm just thinking it is.
well, the question you're going to have to ask and decide is, when we look at putting mitigation sand down, whether it's for this project or for one in Pocomo or one on the South Shore or wherever it is, when you're putting that sand down, that sand is being put down as mitigation sand for the bank, not eroding. But I think you have to ask yourself if indirectly, if that sand is then the sand that's put there instead of the bank doing it to essentially be nourishing that beach. So it's kind of a catch on how you read it a little bit, but I don't want to not bring it up and then not have it discussed if it is a sticking point, because it's one of those that, I mean, all mitigation sand is put there essentially to nourish the beach, not just to.
So we get back to the question of how much sand can you put on that beach for mitigation in case of a big storm? It always rolls back to the limits.
Well, part of this looks more quantitative than at what time the sand erodes, which is one of our biggest problems, is inability to put sand there and have it released when it needs to be released in the event of a storm, or during a storm, and through the whole storm. So, but this seems pretty clear cut on 4. All possible mitigation measures shall be taken as determined by the Commission to limit the adverse effects of the fill.
Which in this particular case means another form of protection.
Yeah, in other words, it should only erode during big storms, not during small storms. Being unconsolidated, it might be eroding prematurely. I don't know that. I mean, I think that they tried, but I don't know if we met this. What do you think?
I don't know if it's possible to.
I'm not sure it's possible to either.
No.
So I would say it's not that.
Okay. We can go to number 10.
Well, if it's not possible, then have they done it?
Have they tried? Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it's- Well, again, I'm not an engineer, but I think I have an idea of what I want to say, but I do think there's things they could do that would change this project to make it function much better than this, but it's not for me to design.
Well, you could say if more of the sand was inside something like a core bag and not sitting loose on the top, then it might not come out in small storms or minor winds, when it normally wouldn't come off the bank or off the beach. Even on a beach, it's wet. It's all at high. It's in the intertidal area. It's providing habitat.
Yeah, well, anyway. Okay, Jeff, did you get the gist of all that?
Okay. Do we want to address number 10, which is can impose additional requirements as are necessary to protect the interest protected by the bylaw?
Well, that's just that you guys can put on whatever
Yeah.
conditions you feel
So that's
necessary.
it.
It's kind of the catch if there's something that doesn't fall within the performance standards. But that's on all of the local.
If you're doing some, if we were trying to address wetland scenic views, for instance, and it wasn't in a prior performance standard, that's where we put it.
Yes.
So we go back to the state's coastal bank? Because it's not a coastal dune.
No, sorry, it just was in the copy.
And it's not, no, it's not a barrier beach. I'm just reading this now for the record. We don't find it's a barrier beach. We don't find it's a dune.
All right, so there's just the 2 determinations to make for the coastal bank. The first one is whether it's significant to storm damage prevention or flood control, because it supplies sediment to coastal beaches, coastal dunes, or barrier beaches. And those standards. And the second one is just that when a coastal bank is determined to be significant to storm damage prevention or flood control, because it is a vertical buffer to storm waters. So you have to determine of whether this bank is both
I think it
a
is
sediment
both.
source
Yeah.
or a vertical barrier, however you want to be.
I think it's both.
I think we're unanimous on that point.
Yes.
So should I make that, do I have to say that loud, or would you like to?
Well, it just states specifically that when a coastal bank is determined to be significant to storm damage prevention or flood control, because it is a vertical buffer to storm waters, 310 CMR 10306 through H will apply, of which 7 is bulkhead revetments, seawalls, groins, or other coastal engineering structures may be permitted on such a coastal bank, except when such bank is significant to storm damage prevention or flood control because it supplies sediment to coastal beaches, coastal dunes, and barrier beaches.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a pretty big exception.
Yeah, you'd have to have, I mean, that's when we would write a waiver.
Right.
Yeah, so,
Again, we can't write waivers to the state regulations.
oh, yeah, that's true. So they're basically
which-
saying you can't do it.
You need to also take into consideration the performance standards for banks that supply sediment, because it's doing that. We need to go through it both.
Yep.
So
So definitely the first
Jump
one.
the guns.
That's all right now. So I think it's fair to say we all agree, and I'm happy to do a formal motion, that we have a finding this coastal bank is determined to be significant to storm damage prevention or flood control because it supplies sediment to coastal beaches, coastal dunes, or barrier beaches. So 310, 1033, 3 through 5 shall apply. Should we do them separately then?
Well, I mean, it's kind of the catch, and I'll just throw out my 2 cents on this. Number 7 is essentially saying that you can't have a coastal engineering structure on banks because they supply sediment to coastal beaches, dunes, and flood controls. But above, at number 3, there's a performance standard that allows for, with the requirements that are there for the construction of coastal engineering structures for banks with sediment sources.
Well, I
So-
think that 7 only applies if it's determined to also be a vertical buffer. That's, reading it legalese. It's not A and B, just a B. If B, then 7.
Which B are you talking about?
I'm talking about the only time 7 applies is if we determine that it's a vertical buffer, which is a little different than supplying sediment to a coastal beach. You can be non-vertical and supply sediment.
Oh, no, it's very true. And I'm not the lawyer here, but I think...
I'm just saying that these 3 above don't, just because this negates those 3 above. I understand
Yeah.
what you're saying. I just think they're separated for a reason.
Oh, they definitely are.
Okay, so let's go back to that. When a coastal bank is determined to be significant to storm damage prevention or flood control because it supplies sediment to coastal beaches, coastal dunes, or barrier beaches, 310 CMR 10.303 through 5 shall apply.
Yep. I think we should do it.
Do we have a motion for?
So moved. That we agree to a finding that this is a coastal bank that is significant to storm damage prevention or flood control because it supplies sediment to coastal beaches.
Well, as our discussion is centered around provision 3A, the coastal engineering structure or modification thereto should be designed and constructed so as to minimize, using best available measures, adverse effects on adjacent or nearby coastal beaches.
Well, first, we're just, at this
Just
point,
the
we're
finding
just
above
finding
it.
that this bank is significant to this portion of the regs.
We're making a finding that we can then consider
That will go
3A.
down 3. So,
So I made a motion that
we make that finding. Do I have a second?
you don't need one.
I don't know, but I'll take one.
Second.
This will be a new game,
Did
do
you
we?
second it, Andy?
I'll second it.
Yeah.
Okay, have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion carries unanimously. Okay, now we can go down to 3. I found one thing that's interesting in this, it specifically points out buildings.
Yes.
Prevent storm damage.
We've
to
This is also the standard that we discussed at great length last time.
Yeah. So the state only allows coastal engineering structures to prevent storm damage to buildings
And not to vacant lots.
And not the vacant lots.
or
which-
infrastructure
Right.
or public
except for
infrastructure.
that funky gap lot thing. But
Mhm.
I don't know if the 2 lots on the end of this thing, which I believe are empty,
I wouldn't drag in gap lots. I don't think the state considers them.
and it seems like this thing is too long. It shouldn't go all the way to the, I don't know.
No, because then we're asking, as a separate question, whether it's most effective in minimizing any adverse effects, and I think we've all agreed that it isn't.
Yeah, you're right.
And they don't fit B, which is the applicant demonstrates that no method of protecting the building other than the proposed coastal engineering structure is feasible. And I think this goes to our vote last week as to reasonable alternatives or feasible alternatives. It doesn't say affordable, long-lasting, perfect. It just says some other coastal way of protecting the building. And this is the state regs. This is different than our local. I don't think the applicants demonstrated that there is no other feasible way to protect the building. And in this case, there are areas that aren't buildings. So, no
I
one
think
can.
I think we discussed this performance standard at pretty extensive length last
So in
time.
this case, we would just say they can't meet that.
And I think we've heard testimony that this probably, as far as 3A, adverse effects on adjacent or nearby coastal beaches. Oh my goodness, 6?
Somebody needs this room at 6?
Get out of here. I booked it till 7. All right, keep going. I'll
Yeah.
figure this out.
Well, it's a good thing it's sunny outside.
Yep.
It's going to adjourn for...
Yeah, sunshine. At least we're making progress.
Yeah, and so this is the nearby coastal beaches due to changes in wave action. Yeah, so in this case, they're causing wave reflection, refraction. So, so they can't, as proposed, it doesn't meet A. B, they are allowed protective plantings designed to reduce erosion may be permitted. But the prior two can't be permitted.
And it seems like there would be other methods to protect the buildings other than the proposed coastal engineering structure is feasible.
Well, this is pretty much what we discussed at length last.
Well, and
Especially since this project is designed to protect the road, that, until they can fix the road, depending on who you talk to, I guess.
so since we discussed that for 4,
Mr. Chairman, if I could make a factual correction that the application was amended. If you'd like to ask.
Okay, that's correct, yeah. Okay, thanks. And we did protective plantings, so.
yep. So 4 is, if something, any project on a coastal bank or within 100 feet landward shall not have an adverse effect due to wave action on the movement of sediment from the coastal bank to beaches or land subject to tidal action other than a structure permitted by 310 CMR 1033. So this seems like a, if the one above doesn't apply, this one applies, or vice versa. I don't think it applies in this case. Do we keep jumping ahead, or do we need Jeff here to listen to us ramble?
Wait for Jeff to
Okay.
get right order.
Yep.
Get up on for a quick nap.
Where's John Smith with his,
Oh, I'm fine, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
with his cookies?
Chicken,
Very, very savory chicken.
oh my God.
Another one?
They're downstairs.
Oh, so we're good.
Until
No problem.
7?
What's that?
We're good until 7? We're good forever.
We're good till we're ready to stop.
Oh, I see that. We're by about 7 now.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think, Jeff, you heard us talk about this one too, Great Lane.
We were just discussing 3.
Yes.
4, my question was, does 4 apply? It seems kind of redundant. It basically says,
Other than, yeah.
No, it applies, because this is a project that's on a coastal bank.
yeah, so it double applies. They basically say, even if a structure is permitted by 310 CMR 1033, it still can't have an adverse effect due to wave action on the movement of sediment from the coastal bank to coastal beaches or land subject to tidal action. So it basically says even if it fits in above, it can't fit in here. That's how I read it, but I'm not a lawyer. I'm getting to be, but not there yet.
I'm not a lawyer either, so.
Isn't that how it reads to
The
you?
whole movement of sand in this project is all about wave action and eroding the bank.
Well, that's just, you have to ask the question again, if the project as designed and as, mitigation and things are put in place, are they meeting the performance standard because of the mitigation or from the project design?
Not the way that it's presented, and not the way it can be accomplished. I would say no. I think this is one of the toughest things for them to try to achieve, is this one. Okay, for 5,
There's not any new building.
That doesn't apply.
okay, doesn't apply.
Okay, so now, we're down to the next finding, which do we choose to make this finding? That a coastal bank this coastal bank is determined to be significant to storm damage prevention or flood control because it is a vertical buffer to stormwaters.
I think it is.
CMR 10.336 through 8 shall apply.
I think it is, and, yeah, and when I reread 7, it basically says,
Oh, do we want to
Yeah.
make that finding?
yeah, I would say so, but
Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that motion's carried unanimously. Okay.
so the first one is any project shall have no adverse effects on the stability of the coastal bank. Construction might have had an adverse effect on the stability of the coastal bank, but you could also argue that they're strengthening the stability of the lower coastal bank.
Mhm.
That the idea of the project is
Yeah.
To
stabilize the bank.
Yep. So in this case, this is one performance standard they would,
Oh, God, but listen to 7.
well, that's why I'm saying 7 is,
Bulkheads, revetment, seawalls, groins, or other coastal engineering structures may be permitted on such a coastal bank,
Except.
when such a bank is significant to storm damage prevention or flood control because it supplies sediment to coastal beaches, coastal dunes, and barrier beaches.
so it's saying if it's a vertical buffer and it's significant to sediment supply, you can't have a coastal engineering structure.
Except, yes, it's significant, and I think it is significant to all those
Mhm.
things.
So that one's pretty straightforward.
Okay, now 8, notwithstanding provision of 310 CMR 1033-3-7, no project may be permitted which will have any adverse effect on specified habitat sites of rare vertebrate or invertebrate species.
This one's
It's
actually
not-
kind of non-applicable because we're outside of 1037 refers to mapped habitat. This area is
Okay.
outside.
It's
of
not mapped.
Does it have effects on habitat that's down the beachways?
But it's not in is
We're not
to mapped habitat down the beach, Mass Natural Heritage jurisdiction?
Yeah, I mean, there's habitat down.
Well, then we're-
down this stuff.
I would say,
We're
We're-
outside of the
we're-
project
Well, that
area.
Yeah,
came
we're
back to my
outside.
question of the access, which is actually an integral part of the application.
That actually amazingly is the line where it starts.
Just above
it's
it.
just a
Just
little
to the
north
north.
of there.
So if it's within 200 feet, I believe I was listening to you yesterday explain why a beach was closed, because it was within 200 feet of habitat.
That's a different, those are guidelines from U.S. Fish and Wildlife for the management specifically, for management of vehicles and those
Okay.
restrictions.
That's
That's
a
a-
good point, though.
A different,
Okay.
a different set of rules and guidelines. Those aren't actually regulations, too. Those are guidelines that they specify to minimize the risk of a take. So
I was paying attention.
You were?
I appreciate it, though. Very few people.
Jump to the town.
All right, I'm just going to spare us. All right,
Coastal
so
banks.
so we'll just go through. We've already discussed 1 to great degree. 2 is not applicable. 3 is, but we'll get back to that. 4, 5, 6, 7 are not.
I'm sorry, so you said 1 we talked about a lot, 2's not applicable. This is on performance
Yep.
standards. page
3
31.
is, and then 4 through 7 are not,
Okay.
because we don't have any septic.
So it's just 1 and 3.
And we've
So we
discussed one.
discussed 1, so all
discussed 3 a
projects
lot
will be,
as well.
number 3 reads, all projects shall be restricted to activity. Only reason I'm reading this is because you guys don't have this in front of you. And we should have probably projected it, but shall be restricted to activity as determined by the commission to have no adverse effect on bank height, bank stability, wildlife habitat, vegetation, wetland scenic view, or the use of the bank as a sediment source. I don't think we can do all that.
Well, that's the crux of what a lot of our
Yeah.
discussion has been about the bank as a sediment source.
Yeah.
And whether or not it's properly mitigated or not. And then there's also wetland scenic view,
Wetland
I would
scenic
argue,
views.
in there.
I would argue that it's going to have a profound effect on one of the most scenic
It already has.
areas on the coastline. I know people disagree with if a deed bank can be scenic or not, but you've ever been to Badlands, South Dakota, you know how scenic
So I
erosion.
just can't hear.
Oh, he can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Just arguing that this bank is scenic.
Well, actually, in the characteristics and protected interests, the final, the second to last paragraph, or in the last paragraph of section 205A1, which is on page 29, it says characteristics of coastal banks that are critical to wetland scenic views are bank form, slope, elevation, proportion and scale in relationship to other landforms, vegetative characteristics and diversity, wildlife and habitat, and a sense of presence and solitude.
Yes. Certainly during construction, that is impacting. And you would argue
Some
after the
would
fact.
argue that it's impacted.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that does hurt wetland scenic views. Okay, so is that the only, is that the last one?
That was it.
6 o'clock.
Good job, folks.
So what's the plan?
Just gonna write up a order.
You want us to look at what you've already written up?
Well,
Or would you rather
if
add?
the feeling of the commission is still for the same, I did actually follow the instructions you guys gave me, prepared a draft.
Well, that's good,
But-
since we voted that way.
Well, I wanted to at least get the analysis for the complete.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's good to be thorough.
I think,
And then
yes.
we'll come back and discuss the orders, and we can have more detailed discussions on
Yeah, I'll
Do
have
you need
to-
to do that timing-wise tonight, or what's the? that's
Well,
why I
if we're
said-
going to continue on to another date,
we need updates.
then we need to have a date certain. We also are down to the final 7 days. So it has to, a decision by the board has to be issued within 21 days of the hearing being closed, which would be next Wednesday. We have to
Did everything we...
issue a decision.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
That's all right.
Did everything we discussed tonight make it into the draft that you have?
Yeah, there's probably a little extra in the draft that I'd put together.
So do you want to go ahead and look at that and vote on that tonight?
You may also, procedurally, you may want to check with, do you have any thoughts on procedure, George, on what we should be?
I had asked Jeff if everything we discussed tonight with the performance standards for state and local was included in the draft that he wrote. I think it's really good that we actually, even though it's painful, that we discussed it before we saw what,
Oh, yeah.
a lot of whereases and, so we have two options. We can
Do you want to see
vote tonight, or we can meet in the next few days. So you
I don't
guys,
see any point in waiting.
I think if we have a draft already, it's at least worth going through it now and
yep, let's go through it
determining
now.
whether we're
Where's my copy?
confident or not in it.
Yep,
All right, take one.
if we didn't
Pass
say
it down.
anything new, I'm completely,
Well, there's going to be some stuff. I have some cleanup work to do on it,
okay?
so I'll wait for it to get around, and we'll kind of go over the
Yeah,
structure
this will be
of
helpful to look over.
it. But, like I said, I didn't want to skew anything or skip parts that were in there, so you guys get to sit through the awesome exercise of going through it. So just really quick, the way it's set up is just like normal. There's a little project overview. Within the project proposal that's there, I usually list out kind of all the documents that have gone into discussion. For just time, when I was adding that part in, I need to put it in a little better semblance and order.
Is this everything?
Amazingly.
Okay.
And I'll double check to be sure that I didn't miss anything too. When I went through. So it's a lot. I mean,
It
it's
looks like, yeah.
50 separate submissions, and a lot of them are long. So that it's just a series of findings, really. So it's just findings in relation to what the resource areas are generally. The second one, that it's not located within priority or estimated habitat. And then number 3 is a typo.
Yeah, I was going to say, what?
Number 3 should say
That the three, that
the
the
geotube.
project.
The geotube.
That's read.
Now here, Jeff, you mentioned coastal storm flowage, but we don't say land under the ocean.
Well, land under the ocean comes in under like coastal beach, where the discussions where they tie back together.
Yeah, I was
So
just
it's
curious,
part of the
'cause we
performance
discussed
standards.
that a lot. Okay. So in this case, we would change that to finds that the project as proposed, or whatever.
Yeah, so then, what we kind of do in the discussion that we had tonight is where it kind of goes through, and this is where I need to go through. I kind of grocery shop today for the whole list here, and over the last couple of weeks while I was putting this together, where we kind of spell out the individual. You'll see the first set, like under the state here. You'll find that the coastal beach is determined to be significant to storm damage prevention, flood control, and protection of wildlife habitat. So those are the findings that we kind of had tonight.
Isn't it 310 CMR, or is it Chapter 131? No, you're probably right.
I personally would like to take these home and read
Yeah.
it and compare it to.
I have some revisions to make to it too, but this won't.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what, I'll just for the explanation. So it's kind of a series of findings that someone hasn't met the burden of proof to get to there. So I'll make probably have some revisions to make as well, and then we separate out the town and the state. So
Can you email us your revisions? Is that allowed? Yeah, of course. It's allowed.
yes, you just can't
Yeah.
respond to one another.
Right.
I can send out revisions though.
So-
Do you want to state any now, or just do it in mass?
Let's do it in mass.
Okay. So we just need a time to make sure that we can be here. I can be here almost any day the next 7 days.
Yeah, me too.
We need 48 hours at least
I have to post
for
it.
notification.
Chairman, can I ask a question about what was handed out? Is that a draft denial order under both the state and local regulations?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, it doesn't hurt to read through it thoroughly. I mean,
Well, should we settle on a date to come back, or?
oh, of course, I think we should be able to.
Is
Yeah, the calendar.
this a public document?
The 29th?
Yeah, I'll post it up. It's a draft. So. Yep. It is now.
It is now.
I can do just about Thursday the 5th, we have that NBI meeting.
That's too late.
It's too late. It's got to be before next Wednesday.
So how about next Monday?
Can't do it on next Wednesday?
We can do it on next Wednesday,
Is
but
that pushing it too much?
I have to issue it that day. But that's not a big problem.
So I don't think we're looking at a ton of time anymore, but,
But we're not meeting next
I would do it
Wednesday.
either Monday or Tuesday.
Oh,
next Wednesday, yeah.
I prefer Monday to give some time for.
I've got Monday or Tuesday. Should we do Monday?
Tuesday would be better for me. My truck's going to go in the garage.
Your what?
My truck's going in the garage on Monday. I'm not sure.
How you'll get here.
Yeah, you good for Tuesday?
But I can do Monday. No.
I can do Tuesday.
Mike? Tuesday, okay? Tuesday the 3rd?
Any day is fine with me.
Okay. Well, should we
Ian,
go
does
for-
that work?
Yeah, it does.
Okay, should we go for Tuesday the 3rd?
Okay.
Here in this-
We'll do it at 4 p.m. Well, we'll meet at 4. We'll be done.
We'll meet at 4. If we feel like we need longer, do we have downstairs if necessary?
I'll find the space.
Okay, so right now we're looking at this room at 4 o'clock on the 3rd.
4 o'clock on the 3rd.
Unless we hear from Jeff otherwise.
Yep. I'll get it all
Okay.
posted.
Okay, do we need a motion to continue that date, or can we just do it by unanimous consent?
You can do it by consent, just like a regular
We'll just
continuance.
continue we'll continue this to June 3rd at 4 o'clock in our regular meeting room.
Mr. Chair, too, I don't think you need me here for that, but I should note, if any questions come after, don't hit reply all, but just send any questions that you may or may not have for council through Jeff, and he and I will refer before them in case there's anything.
This-
I'll also consult with Jeff as well.
Yep.
So he'll review.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Does Tuesday, so what time do you think you'll be able to send out your revision?
I'll have them to you tomorrow.
Okay, great.
Great. Okay.
It's kind of on the top of my priority list. So,
So we'll have, council will have a chance to review.
yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, thanks for coming out, George.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming out, George. Do we actually move to adjourn and continue this until?
Well, just move to continue, then you would just, it's just like normal.
Yeah,
We've
so we're
continued
moving-
it, so we're just moving to adjourn the
So
meeting.
we'll move to adjourn.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, guys.
Any opposed? Thanks, everybody, for sitting through all of that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm sure I get pedantic.
Well, it's good to have you.